Thanks everybody for joining us. Today is March the 20th, 2022, and this is the Group 37 of the Twin Cities monthly meeting. We're pleased to be joined today by Cristofer Carballo. Cristofer is going to talk to us about the Venezuelan human rights crisis. And with that, rather than introduce Cristofer, I'm going to let him give us a brief introduction and then jump into his topic. So we'll have the presentation, and probably around 2:35 or 2:40, we will break and have a Q&A with Cristofer. Take it away, Cristofer. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here with you all. Yeah, you know, for me, this is quite important because you are all advocates of this. I mean, you are not like the general public. You are people that are actively seeking to bring some justice to the world. So I'm happy to be here with you. I was saying, Katia, and for all of you, that I'm really happy to be here because of who you are. I mean, that you are advocates for justice and for freedom. So I'm really happy to be here. And I hope that, I mean, the output or the outcome for me of this meeting is that you are going to be much more aware about the Venezuelan situation, and you're going to be also advocates for the Venezuelan democracy. And I find that this topic is especially important to be spoken here in the States, because I know that there could be a lot of information in the media. I mean, a lot of news that some of them could be very accurate, but maybe some of them are not. So I really want to have this conversation. Well, for introducing myself, as I've been asked, well, my name is Cristofer Correia. I mean, I know it is not easy to read it, to pronounce it. Actually, that last name is kind of Portuguese because my grandparents from the side of my dad are from Portugal, migrants in Venezuela. So it's Cristofer Correia. I'm a Humphrey Fellow, which is this fellowship is a Fulbright program sponsored by the State Department, in which we are placed in different universities across the states according to our areas of interest. So the people that are working in public policy, which is my case, we are placed either here at the Humphrey School in the University of Minnesota or at the Maxwell School at the University of Syracuse. And I was placed here in Minnesota, so I've been working here researching on that and public policy, especially with a focus on poverty and urban development. That's like my real area to research about inequalities within cities, because that's an important issue, especially in Latin America. I mean, how poverty is manifested in cities, because we have, well, a lot of issues around housing. We have informal settlements, we have slums in which people actually cannot exercise their rights, in general, their human rights. So that's my focus beyond the fight for the democracy in Venezuela. Because I mean, recovering the democracy and recovering the freedom is in Venezuela, and recovering our institutional framework, rule of law, check and balances, all of that, that's important, but that's only like the first step. That's like a mean for achieving something greater, which is a society in which everybody can actually have and exercise their rights and opportunities. So that's my focus, and I've been working in the public affairs for several years in different projects. I'm also a political activist. I am part of a political party. I've been working before coming here on the National Assembly, elected in 2015. I've been the Director General of the Citizen Participation Office of the Congress. Among, like, you know, other things, I'm also lecturing public management in a university back home. Oh yeah, well, that's me, and that's my motivation. What I said about issues around poverty, and well, in the very short term, or well, also in the long term, but that which is the first task to be accomplished, to have a country in which well, we have the most basic things like democracy or energy or drinkable water, that kind of essentials for all the rest. I'm going to share some slides just for, because I in this conversation, when I talk about, some milestones of what has happened in Venezuela, I want to show you also some pictures of the demonstrations, some pictures. I don't know if I have any video on that. I will be talking about this. I will try to be brief. That's absolutely complicated for me, because if I talk about Venezuela, I can be here for easily 3 hours. I don't want to I don't want to do that, and I cannot, but I'll try my best to be brief. Well, about Venezuela, the first thing that I want to say, I also gave a lecture about, a conference like this in the University of Minnesota last year in December. The first thing that I try to explain to the students, the first thing that I would like to say here and everywhere, because it could be complicated to understand the situation, because I mean, everybody understands situations according to their context and background, but you are very global. But I want to say that the situation that we have in Venezuela is not, and this is the first thing, it is not a situation in which we have like the left wing fighting with the right wing or vice versa. I mean, it is not a situation of, capitalist supporters against socialist supporters and something like that. The situation it is not that. The situation that we have in Venezuela, and the crisis that we have in Venezuela it is actually a struggle, but between dictatorship and freedom, autocracy against liberty. And that's like the main frame of this. And I mean, the Maduro's regime, they claim, and the Chavez, which is the same party as Chavez, the former president who passed away like in 2013, they claim that they are a socialist party, and we can talk about that. And they, at some point, where the prices of the oil were extremely high, they achieved some things. And also, I have to say, they were good at the beginning, at the diagnosis part, saying that in Venezuela we had inequality, and in Venezuela we had to address poverty. But then the outcomes of that were not correct. I mean, we didn't, and now we don't have a country in which we don't have inequality. Actually, we have a higher, or maybe one of the highest inequalities rates in the region. Well, for sure, one of the highest poverty rates in the world. I will show you some facts about that. We are around 90% of poverty rate in Venezuela. And yeah, I mean, they claimed that they were socialist or progressive or whatever. They didn't use the word progressive, but more socialist in a classic way. However, I want to say that within the opposition coalition, I mean, among those democratic political forces that believe in democracy, there are groups that feel identified with more right-wing policies, but also very leftist parties. Like the majority of the opposition is very left. Very left-wing. For instance, my party, which is called Voluntad Popular, the political party led by Leopoldo Lopez, who was in prison for 6 years and then he escaped and he's now in Spain. It's a party member of the International Socialist. And that's the same party of the interim president, Juan Guaido, and we will talk about that to explain how we get to that point. And I mean, it is a party which slogan is all the rights for everyone. I mean, we had the second transgender congressperson in the region just after one in Uruguay. And that was from my party. I mean, we really believe in that. We are a feminist party and that. So what I want to clarify is that not the majority of the opposition, actually it is, yeah, it's just a small part of the opposition feels identified with the right wing. And you know, another party, the oldest party in Venezuela, Acción Democrática, which had presidents, and that the chair of the party is the vice president of the International Socialists. So what we have, I mean, for wrapping up, what we have in Venezuela, this is a clarification. It is not an ideological discussion in classic terms. It is not about right wing against left wing. It is about people that are holding the power, and they are extremely corrupt. They have led Venezuela to an immense crisis, to the highest diaspora in the history of the Western Hemisphere, the biggest one, and with the longest hyperinflation in the history of the world. And on the other side, they are very repressive, and they are like a dictatorship in all means. And on the other side, we have a wide spectrum of parties and ideologies, but that believe in democracy and freedom and rule of law and freedom of speech and so on. So that was the first thing. So I say that you may know that we in Venezuela are going through a very severe humanitarian crisis. I will show you some facts and some figures about this. I mean, we don't have official data in Venezuela, I mean, produced and released and collected by the state, but like we have a very important survey organized by the civil society. It is a project of the three most important universities. They collected the data, and the result of the last nationwide survey that they did about living conditions showed that more than 90% of the population is living under poverty, is living on poverty. I mean, and you can know that by some other figures, like the minimum wage. Last month, the minimum wage was $3 a month, and now they increased the minimum wage to $30 a month. No, not the hour, not the day, not the week. That's the monthly wage. And Venezuela is not a cheap country. It is not a cheap country. I mean, it's complicated, and we can talk about that. I know that you will ask, or you are wondering about how can actually people live with that. I can say so many things, like most of people don't pay for rent because you are either an owner, you are an owner because of the hyperinflation, you got your mortgage paid, or because you self-built your house, and the public services has been always very cheap in Venezuela. And I mean, there are some things, and especially that the people don't live with a minimum wage because they do so many things. I mean, if the people working several things, they sell things at their houses, they move around to try to make at least, 100 a month or something like that, and with that you are going to survive. And well, this is like the poverty trend in Venezuela. I mean, you can see that during the years of the immense oil boom of the prices, in which the prices of the barrel were above $100, and the Chavez government implemented a lot of social policies, we got a rate of 30% around of poverty, and less than 10% in extreme poverty. And now after 2013, the economy just collapsed. And why that happened? Well, it has a lot of reasons, and I can talk about that later on the questions. But I want to show you how the situation is now in Venezuela, and why we say that, and we are recognized as going through a humanitarian crisis. I mean, You can see here 74 percent of drop in our GDP in 6 years, which is, I mean, we lost almost our whole economy during those years. That's what I was saying. I mean, people earn more than the minimum wage, but still they earn very, very few. That's why people live with, well, in poverty conditions. And this is about the hyperinflation. You know that, and now you are here in the States very worried and aware about inflation because that's so destructive. I mean, that steal the capacity of saving or buying for to the people. And in Venezuela, I mean, in Latin America, I guess, in the region and in Venezuela, we have always been used to some high inflation, like around between 15 or 30% of inflation annually. But what we got starting in 2017 was a hyperinflation, more than 1,000% of inflation annually, and that was that around those years we had the biggest crisis in Venezuela, and it was the longest in the world. Before of that, I mean, the other countries that had hyperinflations, none of them lasted more than 2 years. We had a hyperinflation of 4 years, and like 2 months ago, finally, we are not on hyperinflation. We are, I think that we are still the highest inflation in the world, but we are not above 50% monthly of inflation. But still, our economy is very, very complicated. And that has led to, well, this I think that this is a very clear outcome of how people felt the economy or this general situation in Venezuela. Now, now we have the migration from Ukraine, but before of that, if I talk like a month ago, Venezuela was the largest migration in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. Between 2014 and 2020 or 2019, we have been losing people fleeing the country where around 1 million of Venezuelans yearly. And around those years, more than 5 million people left the country, and our population is 30 million. So we lost in the last years around the 20% of the population just fleeing the country away because the situation was extremely harsh. People didn't have what to eat, didn't have jobs, and didn't have money. So the people were just escaping the country. Besides other situations like, that is very unsafe and that kind of things. But they, in Venezuela, at the ranks of at the top of the concerns of Venezuela usually was like civil security, safety, and that, because there was a lot of crime. But when this started, that just went down in the top of priorities of people, and the economy went to the very first position about concerns. So yeah, I mean, according to what we predict, if nothing changes, by the end of this year, we are going to have more migrants and refugees than Syria. And we are keeping more or less the same track and the same rate of migrants fleeing the country way yearly. Now Syria has like 7 millions of migrants and refugees, and Venezuela has around 6.5 millions of migrants, and most of them have fled the country very recently. As you can see here, these are millions. I mean, you can add 3 zeros here. By 2015, in Venezuela, there were out of the country, living out of the country, around 700,000 Venezuelans in the diaspora. And starting at that point, we got very quickly to now it is 6 million. So it's been a very severe crisis what we had in Venezuela. Well, this is where the people is migrating, especially to Latin America, because they can go walking, basically. Okay, let me see the time. Okay, well, I'll try to do this quickly. Well, we have that's the situation for the people, because I always want to talk about what the people is going through more than just about politics, and what I've been referring to are human rights violation, because human rights are everything. I mean, we usually relate human rights to civil and political rights. That's important. We are going to talk about that in this part of this presentation. But I mean, in Venezuela, it's been people didn't have access to exercise their rights, their economic, socials, and cultural rights, and so on. So, yeah. Well, in Venezuela, we have this has been led by dictatorship. It was framed like this. I mean, in Venezuela, it was not always a dictatorship. During the Chavez times, it's been a very progressive. Uh, well, it has been very progressive how the regime has become more and more authoritarian, because Chavez got elected in free elections in 1998, and then he won several elections. We could say that he was kind of populist and somehow, but he was winning elections, but he was building uh, an institutional framework in which he could control all the rest of the branches of power. So he was doing that. It was becoming a bit more hegemonical, but with the Maduro regime, things got really worse. I'm going to talk about what Maduro has been doing and controlling institutions and repressing the opposition. I have here some highlights about some things some features of the regime that we have in Venezuela. I mean, we have no free media. I mean, most of the uh, TV channels and that they have been closed. The same for the newspaper and the same for the radio. And also they are very good at controlling social media, because they have a lot of bots and trolls and that, so they can control more or less the public opinion. It's been an state very presidential. I mean, much more than in here. I mean, there was no parliament for controlling what the president could or couldn't do. The state was co-opted by the ruling party, so like more similar to China model. And it's been a systematic attack to the opposition and also to the civil society. Uh, I mean, Amnesty or that kind of group we have been having a very difficult time in Venezuela, because they say that it is illegal to get international funds. And they punish uh, private donors within Venezuela. So, I mean, the capacity of the civil society, it is still there, because that's a way for people for expressing themselves or for achieving uh, different goals or for working for different issues. But it's been really complicated if you are not a explicitly loyal group to the regime. And and the regime is a military regime. I mean, most of the high-level positions are controlled and held by the military. Now I'm going to go through very quickly about what has happened in Venezuela in the last years since Maduro became president. So in 2013, Maduro won. This is a screenshot of the official TV channel of the state, how they were showing the election results. But yeah, after Chavez passed away, Uh, New elections were called. So Maduro, for the officialism, ran against an opposition candidate. They won. There were some claims that they were not fair. At that point, the elections were not totally fair, but now the space for having a free elections in Venezuela and fair elections it's smaller. But I mean, they won the elections, and some things have been happening. For instance, in 2014, after the crisis was starting, and this was before U.S. sanctions. The U.S. sanctions against the oil industry in Venezuela started in 2019, way before the crisis was in a very important point, way after, sorry. In 2014, we had very important demonstrations in the streets in Venezuela, and well, a lot of people was killed, and that's why, because of this demonstration, the demonstration in 2017, Maduro is being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. He's the first president being prosecuted being a president, so it's in the region. So it is a very interesting case because it's very prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. So this was extremely violent, repressed, and he was at the moment something that Chavez didn't do at his times. He put into prison the most important opposition leader by that time, that was Leopoldo Lopez, and he was in prison until last year, and at the time that he escaped. But in 2015, and nothing happened with those demonstrations. They just controlled the demonstrations. In 2015, we went to election of the parliament, and the opposition won 2/3, so a super majority of the National Assembly of Venezuela. That was kind of surprising because the elections weren't free enough or competitive enough, but still the opposition won the parliament. But the parliament after that was absolutely void, because of some tricks that they did with the judiciary and with the executive branch. Actually, this period of the National Assembly between 2015 and 2020 didn't pass one single law, even though they had the members for passing law. But every law that they tried to pass, the judiciary said that they were unconstitutional, and at the end they said that the whole assembly was unconstitutional. So this parliament didn't have real power for doing things. And so we had more demonstrations about that, and these are some pictures about the demonstrations in 2017, because these demonstrations were led by the National Assembly, because the National Assembly was absolutely void. Actually, at this point, was what sparked the demonstration was that the judiciary said that the National Assembly couldn't do anything. So the people went to the streets for demonstrating, mainly peacefully. The response of this, the regime created a national constituent assembly, like an assembly just for creating a new constitution, something that they didn't do. They had that just for bypassing the National Assembly controlled by the opposition. They had this for 4 years, and then they closed it. They closed this constituent assembly without trying to create a constitution. They didn't create that. It was just for bypassing the Congress. So these are just some. This was an attack to the parliament. We suffered 2 attacks, like January 6th. Well, we had that in Venezuela 2 times, in which some loyalists to the regime came and attacked the National Assembly. These are Congress people. They were attacked by these groups on that year. This guy on the floor is also a congressman. This is a video, but we don't have time for that. So these are just some pictures about the violence of the regime in Venezuela. And they have also like some paramilitary groups. And this is, I like to show this picture also because this guy here, this is my brother who was put into prison at some demonstration. He was just going back home. He was on his motorbike. He was coming back home. He was doing nothing actually. He was coming back home, but the National Guard stopped him, and then they took him to jail because he was demonstrating before, and they did some very bad things to him. Well, they tortured him. He burned him with cigarettes. They, he was punched by several people at the same time. They forced him to swallow the, the tear gas has it left, so it left some dust, and they made him to swallow that of the tear gas. So he was tortured for some hours, and then with some connection we got him released. Well, I can't think about this peacefully now. It was a very horrible time for the family. I was protesting every single day. There was a time in which all of us were going to the streets like daily, on a daily basis, for like 3 months. And at some point, I remember this because I remember the feeling. So you can figure out how the repression was at that point. That around the second month of the demonstrations in 2017, I wasn't that afraid of going to jail because I had too many friends in jail that I knew that I wouldn't be alone. So I felt like kind of relief. Like if they put me into jail, I know so many people because I had so many friends in jail. So I felt like kind of relief at the time. So I remember that I felt like, okay, like, oh, that's not correct. But um, well, that was it. I mean, the response for the demonstrations claiming for uh, giving back the autonomy to the Congress was to creating this um, new assembly that I told you about. Um, well, some more facts about the demonstrations in 2017, and well, several people were killed by the police in those 3 months of demonstrations. And coming to like more current times, in 2018, we in Venezuela had presidential elections. What happened there in the presidential okay. What happened in the presidential elections in Venezuela in 2018? All the opposition parties were banned. All the opposition candidates were banned. So the opposition boycotted the elections. So Maduro ran against the people that he wanted to run against. And obviously he won. I mean, it was like the the turnout was the lowest in the history of our presidential election in Venezuela, and that because I mean they were not competitive beyond that. The candidates and the parties couldn't participate. It was really unfair because the popularity of the officialism of the Chavism currently in Venezuela at that time it was less. It's being around it's around the 10% of the population who support the Maduro's regime now, or who support that Chavez legacy, which is kind of obvious. I mean, the people are there is very few families. There are very few families that don't have a relative who has left the country for trying to get a better future, or hasn't experienced this hyperinflation and the harsh crisis. So the popularity rates of the regime are very low. So the presidential elections were coming, so they had to do something for not losing the election. So they controlled them so they couldn't lose them. So moving people that should vote, like in people living in Minneapolis and should vote in Minneapolis, they place them in Miami in those centers that the opposition win. So making it impossible for the opposition to win. At the end, the opposition decided not to participate. What happened next is that the Maduro's period ended. The first election, his first period ended in January 2019. At that moment, the National Assembly, Juan Guaido was the president of the National Assembly by that point. We claim that there was a void on the executive branch because presidential elections were not held. Legit presidential elections didn't happen, didn't occur in Venezuela. So according to our constitution, when there is a void in the executive branch, when there is no president, the president of the National Assembly should take over for calling for new elections in the shortest period possible. So that was the what happened. Actually, we said that Maduro was usurping the power because he didn't run to for election. So the National Assembly had to take over the executive branch and call for new elections, and that's how Juan Guaido became the interim president of Venezuela, holding that position of the executive branch, being the president of the National Assembly. I'm sure that you have heard about this situation in which we have two presidents. After that, it was widely recognized by the Western world that Juan Guaido was the legitimate president of Venezuela because of this situation, because this void of the executive branch, because it was according to our law, our constitution. So he was recognized as the legitimate president by the European Union, by the United States, by all the countries in Latin America, most of the countries in Latin America, and for several countries across the world. More than 60 countries recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate president. But it's been a struggle. I mean, not because of that, Juan Guaido was, I mean, our plan was to, because of that, we could eventually control the military, so they would, take control of the country somehow, for taking, getting rid of the dictatorship of the Maduro regime and calling for new, free and competitive elections. That has not happened. That was the moment in which several countries repressed more, harder the Maduro's regime and imposed sanctions, like Canada, States, and the European Union, trying to force the Maduro regime to call to fair elections, and that has not happened. And so, yeah, I mean, here we are. Then in 2020, they started to do some other things, like buying Congress people, actually buying Congress people that were in the opposition, but they offer like, okay, like $5 million, and then you vote for the Maduro's regime. I mean, some things that are not that important. I mean, and here we are. We are in that conflict in which we have this legitimate presidency, but the real, the real politics show that Maduro is still the person who holds the power. They are a very repressive dictatorship, and they are not very prone to call to competitive elections. But so what do we do? And that's where we are now. I mean, we have been trying to negotiate with the regime for trying to reach some kind of agreement for going to a competitive elections. There were some negotiations taking place in Mexico with the mediation of Norway. They are experts on that, but that stopped. So because the regime didn't want to participate. So because, I mean, honestly, we have lost our leverage. I mean, they control the country. The international community is looking somewhere else. So even though we have the support of the population know, and we know that with demonstrations and with going to the streets, it is also very complicated to achieve any kind of goals, because they are very repressive and they don't care about anything. So here we are. What is our perspective? That we are going to go to the next presidential elections in 2024. from here to there, we have to try to get the best electoral conditions possible so that people can express. We are not going to have totally free elections because it is a dictatorship, but I hope that we can have an elections in which we can actually just to compete, and we are going to win because the population is not with them. So that's the situation. We are still in this crisis. Yeah, let's talk. Uh, I took a long time. Sorry, Debbie.
Yeah, I kind of hold the United States somewhat responsible for just putting the screws to Venezuela. You know, we don't like an alternative economic system especially on the hemisphere. And one of the things, I mean, I just finished reading the Red New Deal, which is about Native Americans, and they said something that blew my mind because we're trying to be self-sufficient with oil here in America, in the Western, you know, up in like America and I mean, US and Canada. And so that was also to get away from getting Venezuelan oil, which really, I think when you talk about how the economy just crashed in Venezuela, I think that had to do with stopping oil imports from Venezuela. That just shattered everything that that Chavez was trying to do to improve the lives of people. And that's why we're dealing with pipelines from tar sands here and you know, all the fracking and stuff like that, where we really, so we've got some problems here. So I think part of the problem that Venezuela became so, some of the problems actually came from the US trying to, well, you got my point. So I could say it over and over, but that's one of my concerns. And I wish that we would get oil from Venezuela instead of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think that Gary has the same point. What I can say there about that is that, well, I think that the American foreign policy towards Latin America has not been correct in general, but in this specific, the crisis started before the sanctions. I mean, what happened is that they were so, the regime was so corrupt, and they led the oil industry also to bankruptcy. I mean, we have no capacity of producing not even 1 million of barrels now. I mean, the production of oil was decreasing because of the mismanagement, because the lack of investment. I mean, even that, imagine the situation in which we have no sanctions for exporting oil, that would help, but still we don't have the capacity for exporting the same amount of oil that we were exporting like 10 years ago, because they led the industry to almost a bankruptcy situation. So I think that the US sanctions doesn't help to the country to recover, but the crisis started before of that. I mean, that could make the crisis harder, but that is not the main cause of the crisis. That's one point. Yeah, Paul.
A couple questions. Do you? I think it would be the proper U.S. policy right now. I mean, people are saying, well, if the Russian oil embargo is causing us problems, we can relieve part of that if we bought oil from Venezuela. And the other question is, there's been pressure on Venezuela, but Maduro doesn't seem to respond. I mean, it's the same thuggish behavior that goes on and on. I mean, he's obviously a thug, but what can the Latin American states and the U.S. do to help affect change in Venezuela?
Mm. Okay, well, I mean, coming back to that point, I mean, about the oil exports and that Venezuela has the capacity for exporting oil. I mean, at the same level as Ecuador or less than Colombia now, because I mean, we lost that capacity, even though we have the largest reserve of the world. About what we can, or in general, the international community can do for helping Venezuela, I think that we have tried as international community to force them with, the sanctions or any kind of punishment, and that hasn't worked, or hasn't worked out that well. I think that what could be done now, or what could be important to do now, is try to force the regime to come back to a negotiation table to agree on some conditions for having free elections on the time that they want. I mean, trying to get a middle point on that. So what I think that the international community can do is to try to create the incentives for the regime to talk with the opposition and to release some conditions in which the opposition can compete in elections. That would be the goal. I mean, and the international community have been trying a lot of things. I mean, Norway is trying to lead a negotiation. Mexico is setting the table for that, and Latin America is also pushing. The U.S. has had a very more like fierce policy, and the European Union have been trying something different. I, I mean, what we want is to have a fair election. Everything that on that direction would be helpful.
I mean, is he like Putin? He just doesn't care about his people. I mean, he doesn't care what happens to him. I mean, it seems like that's the attitude.
If that, I think that I'm totally sure that they initially had a lot of good intentions, but after 20 years in a regime in which you don't have accountability, you get extremely corrupt, you get extremely powerful, and you become an oligarchy that only wants to hold more and more power and be more and more rich. So I think that they care very few about the people now. It wasn't like that all the time, but it is now at this moment. They even refuse that there is a crisis. They refuse that there is a diaspora and a migration of people fleeing the country. So yeah, I think that they care the most about just keeping the power. Let me see here some comments. Panda, you can go on. I'm just checking the chat, but
I just have a question, please. So after this presentation, what do you think Amnesty can do to help the crisis?
Well, Amnesty have been very helpful, especially with political prisoners, to speaking up about the people in prison. I think that has been really important. I mean, that's something that Amnesty knows how to do well. I think that that's something that you have to keep doing, talking about the repression, the lack of freedom of speech, the political prisoners that there are still in Venezuela. And Gary is asking me about how many political prisoners are in jail today. I don't know the exact number now, but because that varies, because they put more people into jail, they release people, and that's it. But above 100, that might be the number. Above 100, between 100 and 200 at this point. So not the highest point or the highest rate on the history of the regime, especially because they are under that prosecution of the International Criminal Court. About the feeling of the citizens to the public affairs, what Birch is asking about, there is some kind of apathy now, because the citizen has been very engaged in elections or in demonstrations, but people disengage when they feel that what they do has no result. I mean, if you feel that you're going to vote or you're vote is not going to count, just stop believing in that. If you feel that you are putting a lot on a stake, going to the streets and nothing happened, I mean, you start being more and more apathical about it. So at this point, people are just trying to get used to the new Venezuela, to get used to the crisis. I mean, the situation has been improving a bit. Still, it is in a survival point. But the people are just trying to survive and caring a bit less about what happens with the institutional framework.
Thank you very much.
Sorry?
Oh, I just said thank you very much.
No, you're welcome, Panda. The question that Mike is asking, I don't feel, usually I don't feel comfortable pointing fingers to a specific institutions because I'm coming back. So usually I wouldn't do this. In Venezuela, I don't talk about dictatorship. I don't say that word. I don't say a lot of words. I censor myself a lot because I want to keep free and alive. So I mean, there are a lot of police forces and you know, there are some that are worse than others.
Is there perhaps another resource we could look at? It does keep track of the names of the.
I can share it, some information with you in a non-recorded session.
Okay, thank you. We understand.
Yeah, and it is so. I mean, it's so complicated to try to be involved with the public affairs in Venezuela. I mean, I used to have a radio program, a live, you know, in lifetime. I stopped doing it because it's too risky. I mean, you have to think twice what you are saying for saying it correctly, for, you know,
Please be
balancing
careful.
things.
Please be careful.
Panda, you want to say something else?
Yes, if you
Okay.
guys don't mind, I have another question.
For me, it's okay.
How is online advocacy different from physical advocacy?
So sorry, can you repeat that?
How is online advocacy different from physical advocacy?
Well, I mean, we do both. I mean, online advocacy, you can reach out to, well, in the international community, you can go to online campaigns like in Twitter or you know, getting some trendy hashtags and that, you know, speaking up about different issues. And even for training, also, I mean, online advocacy is good for training, for then going back to the ground and doing things, say, physically. I think that we have done a lot in Venezuela. We have gone through all the non-violence strategies. We have gone to, we have done like going to elections, boycotting elections, going to the streets, not going to the streets. I mean, we have done a lot of things, and I think that we have achieved something. I think that without the things that the citizenry has done in Venezuela, I mean, the regime would have even more control over the society. But yeah.
Do you think that people are very receptive with the content that's shared online, so social media and everything? Because in other parts of the world, if I take the Palestinian cause, for example, or other worldwide issues, people tend to be very active on social media, and they draw their main actions or inspiration to act for their movements or groups through social media, because they're very receptive of social media. Would you say it's the case with Venezuelans, or?
I think that, yeah, Venezuelans are quite active on the social media for speaking about different issues. I mean, still being careful, you know, meditating what you are saying, but yeah, I think that people engage in public discussions on the social media with all the risks that come with that, and also like all those issues about fake news that are very common and that kind of things. Um, let me read this question of Mario.
Yeah, this one's from Matthew. He's asking about
Mhm.
the regime at least cares about its own general citizen well-being. Wouldn't they be interested in working with other countries if in exchange for some aid programs?
So the stick of sanctions hasn't worked, but even just to keep paying Maduro's soldiers, is there some kind of carrot approach that would get them into positive negotiations?
I don't know. The international community sometimes has offered that for free, and they didn't allow that to come to the country because they say that they don't need it because there is no crisis. There is no such a crisis. So, I mean, that has been offered. And that's part of what the opposition brings to the table sometimes to allow the international aid to come to the country. And that's been complicated. I mean, there is some international aid that the regime has allowed already to come to the country, some from PAHO or, you know, some aid related to health, you know, health services and that. And the aid that is being delivered by civil society, that has to go like very underground, and it is very complicated to I mean, you could get something, but if you negotiate directly with the regime and you don't call it humanitarian aid, they may accept some things, and that doesn't go to the news, and they are seen as the only owners of the ideas or whatever is bringing to the country. So they're they're not very receptive with humanitarian aid. So that wouldn't be the main leverage for the international community because the public discourse is that there is not such a crisis. So what are you talking about? So that's it.
All right.
And yeah, I need to go, but just for saying this about the churches, the most important church is the Catholic Church in general, and they usually speak up against the regime.
Okay. All right. Let's close off our recording with that. Cristofer, thanks for presenting to us, and hopefully you can join us again soon for another meeting and we can talk about this again.